The morning sun cast long shadows across the grounds of Windsor Castle as Catherine, the Princess of Wales, stood at the window of her private quarters. Her usually bright eyes were rimmed with red, and her hands trembled slightly as she held a cup of tea that had long grown cold. The weight of the news she had received just hours before felt like a stone in her chest. William found her there, still in the same position he had left her in when he went to make the necessary phone calls. His own face showed the strain of the morning's events. The future King of England, known for his composure and strength, looked years older than he had just yesterday. "The children?" Catherine asked without turning around, her voice barely above a whisper. "Still sleeping," William replied, moving to stand beside his wife. "I thought we should let them rest a little longer before." He couldn't finish the sentence. How do you tell your children that someone they loved dearly would never come through those palace doors again? How do you explain the finality of death to young minds that still believed in fairy tales and happy endings? The person they had lost wasn't just anyone. This was someone who had been a cornerstone of their lives, a steady presence who had guided them through their courtship, their marriage, and their journey into parenthood. The palace staff had already begun the formal protocols, but for William and Catherine, this was deeply personal. Catherine finally turned from the window, and William saw the tears she had been trying so hard to hold back. Without a word, he pulled her into his arms. In that moment, they weren't the Prince and Princess of Wales. They weren't future monarchs with duties and responsibilities. They were simply two people grieving a profound loss. "I keep thinking I should call," Catherine whispered against his shoulder. "I keep forgetting that no one will answer." William tightened his embrace. He understood exactly what she meant. For years, that familiar voice had been just a phone call away. Advice about the children, support during difficult times, gentle guidance when the weight of royal duty felt overwhelming. Now there was only silence. The morning routine that usually brought structure to their days felt impossible to face. How could they sit down for breakfast and discuss schedules when their world had shifted so dramatically? How could they smile at their children and pretend that everything was normal? A soft knock at the door interrupted their quiet grief. It was Maria, Catherine's longtime lady-in-waiting, her own eyes showing signs of tears. "Your Royal Highnesses," she said softly, "I'm terribly sorry to disturb you, but there are some urgent matters that require your attention." William straightened, the mantle of duty settling back onto his shoulders even in his moment of deepest sorrow. "Of course. What do we need to know?" Maria held a leather folder with the formal papers that would begin the process of saying goodbye. Funeral arrangements, official statements, coordination with other royal family members. The machinery of monarchy never stopped, even for grief. But as William reached for the folder, Catherine placed her hand gently on his arm. "Can we have just a few more minutes?" she asked. "Before we become public again?" Maria nodded and quietly withdrew. William set the folder aside and took Catherine's hands in his. They both knew that once they opened that door and stepped back into their public roles, their private grief would become shared with the world. Every tear, every moment of sorrow, would be photographed, analyzed, and discussed by millions. "Are we ready for this?" Catherine asked, not really expecting an answer. William looked into her eyes, seeing his own pain reflected there. "We'll never be ready," he said honestly. "But we'll face it together, just like we always have." Outside their window, the grounds of Windsor were already showing signs of the disruption that would soon engulf their lives. Palace staff moved with quiet efficiency, preparing for the flood of visitors, media, and official delegations that would descend upon them in the coming days. But inside that room, for just a few more precious minutes, William and Catherine allowed themselves to simply feel the weight of their loss. They held each other close, drawing strength from their bond, preparing to face a world that would want to share in their sorrow while they were still learning how to bear it themselves. The sun climbed higher in the sky, and soon they would have to wake their children and begin the difficult conversation that would change their young lives forever. They would have to put on brave faces and fulfill their duties to the Commonwealth and the world. They would have to be the steady, comforting presence that millions of people looked to for stability. But for now, in the quiet of their private quarters, they were simply William and Catherine, two people who had lost someone irreplaceable, holding on to each other as their world shifted beneath their feet. The breakfast room at Adelaide Cottage felt unusually quiet as George, Charlotte, and Louis sat around the familiar oak table. 9-year-old George sensed something was different the moment he walked into the room. His parents' smile seemed forced, and there was a heaviness in the air that he couldn't quite understand. Charlotte, now 8, was busy arranging her cereal into neat rows, chattering about her plans for the day. 5-year-old Louis was more focused on trying to balance his spoon on the edge of his bowl, completely absorbed in his little experiment. Catherine watched her children with a mixture of love and heartache. In just a few moments, she would have to shatter their innocent morning routine with news that would mark the end of their childhood in many ways. She caught William's eye across the table, and he gave her the smallest nod of encouragement. "Children," William began, his voice gentle but serious enough to immediately capture their attention. "Mummy, and I need to talk to you about something very important." George looked up first, his young face already showing concern. Charlotte stopped playing with her cereal, and even Louis turned his attention away from his spoon. They had heard this tone before, usually when something significant was happening in their lives. Catherine moved her chair closer to the children. "Do you remember how we talked about how sometimes people get very sick, and sometimes they go to heaven?" Charlotte nodded solemnly. "Like Grandpa Philip," she said quietly. "Yes, sweetheart, like Grandpa Philip," Catherine continued, her voice beginning to waver despite her efforts to stay strong. "Well, someone very special to our family has gone to heaven too." George's face grew pale. At 9, he understood more than his siblings about the weight of such announcements. "Who?" he whispered. William leaned forward, placing his hands gently on the table. The words felt impossible to say, but he knew his children deserved to hear the truth from their parents, not from whispered conversations or overheard phone calls. "Granny," he said simply, and the words seemed to echo in the suddenly silent room. For a moment, none of the children moved. Then, Charlotte's lower lip began to tremble. "But we were going to see her next week," she said, her voice small and confused. "She promised to show me her new dogs." Louis didn't fully understand what gone to heaven meant, but he could see his sister's distress and his parents' sadness. His own eyes filled with tears as he looked around the table at his family. George, trying to be brave like he thought a future king should be, blinked rapidly and asked, "When did it happen?" "Very early this morning," Catherine explained, reaching over to smooth his hair. She went very peacefully, surrounded by people who loved her. "Was she in pain?" Charlotte asked, the question breaking Catherine's heart. "No, darling," William assured her quickly. "She wasn't in pain. She was very old, and very tired, and her body just decided it was time to rest." The explanation seemed to satisfy the younger children somewhat, but George had more questions. As the eldest, he had spent more time with his great-grandmother and understood more about her role in their lives and in the country. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice steady but his eyes bright with unshed tears. William and Catherine exchanged another glance. This was the conversation they had been dreading almost as much as breaking the initial news. Their children's lives were about to change in ways they couldn't fully prepare them for. "There will be some very sad days ahead," Catherine explained gently. "Lots of people loved Granny, not just our family, but people from all over the world. They'll want to come and say goodbye to her." "Like when Grandpa Philip died?" George asked, remembering the formal ceremonies and the crowds of people dressed in black. "Yes, but this will be much bigger," William said carefully. "Granny was very special to many, many people. There will be lots of visitors and lots of ceremonies, and it might feel overwhelming sometimes." Charlotte had been quiet, processing the information in her 8-year-old mind. Suddenly, she looked up at her mother with wide eyes. "Does this mean you and Papa will be king and queen now?" The directness of the question caught both parents off guard, even though they had been preparing for it. Catherine felt her breath catch in her throat. Yes, it did mean that, eventually. It meant their lives were about to change in ways that felt impossible to explain to their children. "Not right away," William said carefully. "Grandpa Charles is the king now. But, yes, someday, things will change for our family." Louis, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly spoke up. "Can we still live here?" he asked, looking around the cozy breakfast room that had been his home for all of his young life. "Of course, sweetheart," Catherine assured him quickly, though she knew that eventually, that too might change. For now, maintaining some sense of normalcy for her children was the most important thing. The family sat in silence for a few moments, each lost in their own thoughts. Then, Charlotte did something that perfectly captured her gentle nature. She got up from her chair and went to hug her mother. "I'm sorry you're sad, Mummy," she whispered into Catherine's shoulder. That simple gesture of comfort from her 8-year-old daughter finally broke through Catherine's careful composure. Tears began to flow freely as she held her daughter close. William reached over to put his arms around both of them, and soon George and Louis had joined the family embrace. In that moment, surrounded by her children's love and support, Catherine realized that even in the midst of overwhelming grief and impending change, she and William had raised remarkable little human beings. Children who could offer comfort even when they themselves were hurting and confused. "We'll get through this together," William told them all, his voice thick with emotion. As a family, that's what Granny would have wanted. Outside their cottage, the world was already beginning to react to the news that would soon be announced officially. But inside their breakfast room, the Cambridge family held each other close, drawing strength from their bond as they prepared to face the difficult days ahead. The black cars moved in a slow, solemn procession through the streets of London as thousands of people lined the sidewalks. Catherine sat beside William in the back of the official vehicle, her black hat casting a shadow over her face, but unable to hide the tears that continued to fall despite her best efforts to maintain composure. The world was watching. She knew that millions of people around the globe were seeing her grief in real time, analyzing every expression, every gesture. But, for once, she couldn't bring herself to care about protocol or public image. The pain was too raw, too overwhelming. Through the bulletproof glass, she could see the faces of mourners holding flowers, some crying themselves, others simply standing in respectful silence. Signs reading, "Thank you," and "We will miss you," were held high above the crowds. The outpouring of love and support should have been comforting, but, instead, it made the reality of their loss feel even more final. William's hand found hers in the space between them, his fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture that spoke of shared strength and mutual support. He too was struggling with the weight of public grief. As the future king, he had been trained from childhood to maintain dignity in public, but losing someone who had been such a constant presence in his life had shaken him to his core. "Look," Catherine whispered, pointing toward a group of children who had made handmade cards. One little girl, no older than Charlotte, was crying as she held up a drawing of a crown surrounded by flowers. The sight made Catherine's heart ache even more, thinking of her own children back at the palace, trying to understand why their world had suddenly changed so dramatically. The formal ceremonies had been carefully planned for years, but experiencing them was entirely different from reading about them in briefings. Every tradition, every protocol, every moment of pomp and circumstance served as a reminder that this wasn't just a personal loss. It was the end of an era for an entire nation and commonwealth. As their car approached Westminster Abbey, Catherine could see the massive crowds gathered outside. World leaders, dignitaries, and ordinary citizens had all come to pay their respects. The sight was both humbling and overwhelming. She thought about how the person they were mourning would have handled this moment with such grace and dignity, never letting the weight of public attention overshadow the solemnity of the occasion. Inside the abbey, Catherine found herself seated among family members who were all struggling with their own grief. She watched as William straightened his shoulders and lifted his chin, falling into the role that had been prepared for him his entire life. But she could see the young boy he had once been, the one who had walked behind his mother's coffin so many years ago, now having to say goodbye to another cornerstone of his life. The service began with the familiar words of traditional hymns, voices raised in collective mourning and celebration of a life well lived. Catherine tried to focus on the beautiful tributes and meaningful prayers, but her mind kept wandering to more personal memories. Quiet afternoon teas, gentle advice about motherhood, the special smile that had always greeted her and the children during family gatherings. When it came time for the reading, Catherine felt her composure slip again. The words about love, loss, and eternal rest seemed to speak directly to her heart. She wasn't the only one affected. She could see other family members dabbing at their eyes, each lost in their own memories and grief. But it was during the final hymn that the weight of the moment truly hit her. As hundreds of voices joined together in song, Catherine realized that this wasn't just goodbye for their family. This was goodbye for an entire generation of people who had looked to this beloved figure for stability and comfort during decades of change and uncertainty. Young mothers in the congregation held their children close, perhaps thinking about their own family matriarchs. Elderly people remembered decades of faithful service and dedication. Commonwealth representatives reflected on the bonds that had been strengthened and maintained through years of careful diplomacy and genuine care. After the service, as they made their way slowly through the abbey, Catherine was struck by the faces of the people they passed. So many were crying openly, not caring about the cameras or the formal setting. Their grief was genuine and deeply felt, and it made Catherine realize that in some small way, the entire world was experiencing this loss alongside their family. The processional route to Windsor seemed endless. Catherine found herself studying the faces in the crowds, seeing her own sadness reflected back at her from thousands of strangers. An elderly woman clutched a framed photograph, tears streaming down her face. A group of young people stood in respectful silence, some holding candles despite the daylight. Veterans in uniform saluted as the procession passed, their own eyes bright with emotion. William squeezed her hand gently, drawing her attention back to the present moment. She would be proud, he whispered, so quietly that only she could hear. Look at how many lives she touched. Catherine nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. Even in her grief, she could recognize the extraordinary legacy of love and service that surrounded them. The person they had lost hadn't just been a family member. She had been a symbol of stability, grace, and dedication that had inspired millions of people around the world. As they neared Windsor, Catherine caught sight of her children waiting with other family members. George stood tall and straight, clearly trying to be brave for his siblings. Charlotte held Louis's hand, both of them looking small and uncertain in their formal black clothes. The sight of them gave Catherine a renewed sense of purpose. No matter how overwhelming her own grief felt, her children needed her to be strong. The final moments of the public ceremony were approaching, and soon they would have a chance for private family time to say their own goodbyes. But even as Catherine looked forward to that more intimate farewell, she was deeply moved by the way the entire world had come together to honor someone they all loved. In their shared grief, she found a strange kind of comfort. They weren't alone in their loss. The gates of Windsor Castle closed behind the last of the official mourners, leaving the royal family alone for the first time in days. The contrast between the public ceremonies and this private moment was stark, where there had been thousands of people, formal protocols, and the weight of tradition. Now there was only family, grief, and the peaceful quiet of the castle grounds. Catherine walked slowly through the corridors that held so many memories, her hand trailing along the familiar walls. Every room seemed to echo with laughter from family gatherings, quiet conversations over tea, and gentle guidance that had shaped so much of her life as a royal wife and mother. The silence felt both peaceful and heartbreaking. In the private chapel, a much smaller group had gathered for their own farewell. This wasn't for the cameras or the history books. This was for the family members who wanted one last chance to say goodbye in their own way, without the formal constraints of state ceremonies. William found Catherine standing before a portrait that had hung in the same spot for decades. In it, the beloved matriarch smiled with the warmth and wisdom that had defined her reign and her relationships with family members across generations. I keep expecting her to walk around the corner, Catherine admitted softly, to ask about the children's schoolwork or whether we've been eating properly. William nodded, understanding completely. The personal loss felt so much more immediate than the historical significance that everyone else was discussing. This wasn't about the end of an era or constitutional changes. This was about losing someone who had been woven into the fabric of their daily lives. Their children approached quietly, still dressed in their formal clothes from the earlier ceremonies. George carried a small wrapped package, something he had been working on privately for the past few days. Charlotte held a handmade card covered in her careful 8-year-old handwriting. Even little Louis had insisted on bringing something, a drawing he had made with his crayons that somehow perfectly captured his innocent understanding of love and loss. "Can we put these with Granny?" Charlotte asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Catherine knelt down to her daughter's level, taking the card gently in her hands. The cover showed a simple drawing of a castle with hearts floating around it, and, inside, Charlotte had written in her best handwriting, "Thank you for teaching me about kindness and for always having biscuits ready for tea." The simplicity and honesty of the message brought fresh tears to Catherine's eyes. Children had a way of cutting through all the complexity and ceremony to reach the heart of what mattered most. George stepped forward with his package, unwrapping it carefully to reveal a small wooden box he had made in his woodworking class at school. "I wanted to make something that would last," he explained seriously. "Something strong like she was." Inside the box, he had placed a collection of small items. A pressed flower from the gardens at Sandringham, where they had spent so many family holidays, a small stone from the beach where they had walked together just months before, and a photograph of all the great-grandchildren together during the last Christmas celebration. Lewis's contribution was typically endearing. His crayon drawing showed stick figures that he proudly identified as the whole family, including Granny, all holding hands under a rainbow. "She's still with us," he declared with the absolute certainty that only a 5-year-old could possess. "Just in a different place." The profound wisdom in his innocent statement struck everyone present. Out of the mouths of babes, Catherine thought, remembering how often children seem to understand the most important truths with startling clarity. As the afternoon wore on, other family members shared their own memories and tributes. Stories were told about private moments of humor and humanity that the public would never see. There were tales of practical jokes, gentle teasing, and the kind of ordinary family interactions that made even royal relationships feel wonderfully normal. Catherine found herself thinking about all the conversations they had shared over the years. The nervous bride who had first entered this family had been guided with such patience and grace. Every major milestone, her wedding, the birth of each child, the challenges of royal life, had been marked by gentle advice and unwavering support. "She taught me that strength didn't mean never showing emotion," Catherine shared when it was her turn to speak. "She showed me that you could be dignified and human at the same time, that caring for people was the most important part of any public role." William spoke about the continuity of values and the importance of service that had been modeled for him throughout his life. But he also talked about the personal moments, the quiet advice before important speeches, the encouragement during difficult times, and the absolute certainty that family love would always be there no matter what challenges they faced. As the sun began to set over the castle grounds, the family gathered for one final moment together. They stood in a circle, each person holding something that represented their connection to the person they had lost, a photograph, a piece of jewelry, a letter, or simply their own precious memories. In that moment, Catherine realized something important about grief and love. The pain of loss was so intense precisely because the love had been so deep. The person they were saying goodbye to had given them all something irreplaceable, not just guidance and support, but an example of how to live with purpose, grace, and genuine care for others. The evening air was soft and peaceful as they finally made their way back toward their own quarters. The children were tired from the emotional weight of the day, and Catherine could see that even George was ready to set aside his attempts to be grown up and just be a 9-year-old boy who missed his great-grandmother. As they tucked their children into bed that night, William and Catherine found themselves talking quietly about the future. The formal period of mourning would continue for days and weeks to come, but the personal process of grief and healing would take much longer. How do we help them remember her properly? Catherine wondered aloud, thinking about her children and the years ahead when their memories might fade. By living the way she taught us, William replied simply. By being the kind of people she believed we could be. It was a simple answer, but Catherine knew it was exactly right. The best tribute they could offer wouldn't be found in grand gestures or formal memorials. It would be in the daily choice to serve others with the same grace, kindness, and unwavering commitment that they had been privileged to witness firsthand. 3 weeks had passed since the funeral, and life was slowly finding a new rhythm at Adelaide Cottage. The initial overwhelming wave of grief had settled into something more manageable, though Catherine still found herself reaching for her phone to call someone who would never answer again, or setting aside interesting news articles to share during conversations that would never happen. The children had returned to school, their teachers having been briefed on their loss and the need for extra sensitivity during this adjustment period. Catherine was grateful for the routine that education provided. Homework, school runs, and playground politics offered a blessed return to normalcy that helped ground the family in everyday life. On this particular morning, Catherine was in the garden with Lewis, who had become fascinated with planting flowers for Granny to see from heaven. His 5-year-old logic was both heartbreaking and healing, and Catherine found herself seeing their loss through his innocent perspective. "Will these flowers grow big enough for her to see them from way up there?" he asked seriously, patting down the soil around a small tulip bulb with his tiny hands. "I think she can see them perfectly," Catherine assured him, meaning it more than she had expected to. "And I think she would love that you're taking such good care of them." William appeared in the garden doorway, holding a letter that had arrived in the Morning Post. His expression was soft, touched with the kind of gentle emotion that had become more common since their loss. The experience of public grief had stripped away some of his natural reserve, leaving him more open to expressing feeling in their private moments. "What is it?" Catherine asked, recognizing the look on his face. "A thank you note," he replied, settling down beside them in the garden. "From a woman in Yorkshire whose grandmother died the same week. She said watching our family grieve openly gave her permission to stop trying to be strong all the time and just let herself feel sad." Catherine felt tears prick her eyes, not tears of sadness this time, but something more complex. Over the past weeks, they had received thousands of letters from people around the world who had been touched by their public display of genuine emotion. Many shared their own stories of loss and found comfort in seeing that even royals grieved like ordinary people. "Are we helping people by being sad?" Lewis asked with the straightforward curiosity that made adult conversations both challenging and profound. "Sometimes showing our real feelings helps other people know it's okay to have feelings too," William explained patiently. "Granny taught us that being honest about hard times can actually help other people feel less alone." Charlotte emerged from the house carrying her school bag, but stopped when she saw her parents and brother in the garden. At 8, she had developed an almost protective instinct toward her family's emotional well-being, often checking to make sure everyone was okay throughout the day. "Are you crying because you're sad or because you're happy?" she asked Catherine, having learned to distinguish between different types of tears over the past few weeks. "A little bit of both, sweetheart," Catherine answered honestly. "Sad because I miss Granny, but happy because we're remembering how much love she shared with everyone." George joined them, having finished his morning reading. As the eldest, he had taken on an even more serious demeanor since their loss, clearly feeling the weight of being the future heir. Catherine worried sometimes about the burden he was placing on his own young shoulders. "I've been thinking about what you said about living the way Granny taught us," he said to his father. "How do we know if we're doing it right?" It was such a profound question from a 9-year-old that both parents took a moment to consider their answer carefully. This was exactly the kind of moment where they missed having their wise counselor to turn to for guidance. "I think we start small," Catherine suggested. "By being kind to people, by thinking about what others need instead of just what we want, by trying to make things better instead of worse wherever we go. Like planting flowers for people to enjoy," Lewis added helpfully, still focused on his gardening project. "Exactly like that," William agreed, ruffling his youngest son's hair. "And like being patient with your sister when she's having a hard day, or helping your classmates when they're struggling with schoolwork." Over the following days, Catherine began to notice small changes in how their family interacted with the world around them. The children were more thoughtful about including classmates who seemed lonely. William had started taking extra time with palace staff, asking about their families, and really listening to their responses. She herself found that she was more present during public engagements, less focused on getting through the schedule, and more interested in genuine connections with the people she met. The shift wasn't dramatic or sudden, but it felt significant. Their grief was transforming into something purposeful, a living tribute that shaped how they moved through their daily lives. One evening, as Catherine was reading bedtime stories to Lewis, he looked up at her with his serious 5-year-old expression and said, "Mummy, I don't think Granny is really gone." Catherine's heart clenched, wondering if he was struggling to understand the finality of death. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" "Well," he said thoughtfully, "she taught you how to be a good mummy, and she taught Papa how to be a good papa, and she taught me and George and Charlotte how to be kind. So she's still here in all the good things we do." The wisdom of his observation took Catherine's breath away. Out of the mouths of babes, she thought again, realizing that her youngest child had perhaps understood something about legacy and continuing love that adults often struggled to grasp. That night, after all the children were asleep, Catherine and William sat together in their living room, talking about the future in a way they hadn't been able to during the immediate aftermath of their loss. "I feel like we're different people than we were a month ago," Catherine admitted. "Not because of the constitutional changes or the new responsibilities, but because of what we learned about what really matters." William nodded thoughtfully. "She always said that the most important thing about any position of service was remembering that it was about other people, not about yourself. I think I understood that intellectually before, but now I feel it in a different way." They talked about their plans for upcoming engagements, but with a new perspective. Instead of viewing them as obligations to be completed, they found themselves thinking about opportunities to continue the work of bringing comfort, stability, and genuine care to people who needed it. The grief hadn't disappeared. Catherine still had moments where the loss felt fresh and overwhelming. But gradually, It was becoming something they carried with them rather than something that carried them away. Their sadness had become woven together with gratitude, love, and a renewed sense of purpose. As they prepared for bed, Catherine looked out the window at the garden where Louis had planted his flowers for Granny to see. In the moonlight, she could just make out the small mounds of earth where bulbs waited to bloom in spring. The image seemed like a perfect metaphor for where they found themselves, having planted seeds of love and service that would grow into something beautiful, even though the person who had taught them how to garden was no longer there to see the flowers bloom. But, perhaps, Catherine thought as she turned away from the window, that was exactly the point. The best tribute to someone who had given so much love was to keep giving love, to keep planting flowers, to keep showing up for other people with kindness and grace. In that way, no one who had truly mattered was ever really gone. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and responsibilities, but it would also bring new opportunities to live out the lessons they had learned. And in that daily choice to serve others with the same dedicated heart they had been privileged to witness, they would keep the most important part of their loved one alive forever.